Welcome to First Response. My name is Bob Plaschke, and for most of my adult life, I've had the privilege to spend time with and serve and support emergency responders. First Response, the title of this podcast, is an effort to get behind the badge and understand the highs and lows that emergency responders face and how they deal with them and how the public deals with them. This podcast is sponsored by Pepperball, where I have the honor to serve as the CEO. Pepperball makes a non-lethal alternative to guns that police use to keep them and the public they serve safe. My guest today, and I'm excited to introduce him, is William Townsell. William is the Assistant Director with the Chicago Police Department's Office of Community Policing. If you may remember, if you're listening to these podcasts, you may remember about a month ago, we had the Deputy Director from the Chicago Police Department, Michael Milstein, who is the Deputy Director of Officer Policing. And if you listen to that, you heard him talk a lot about from what I would call the kind of inside out, talking about how he and the police department tries to engage the public to help them better understand policing. Today with William, we're going to focus more about kind of the outside in. William spends his time engaging with the citizens every day, anywhere from helping landlords be better landlords, tenants, avoid bad landlords, elderly avoiding to be defrauded, and even talking to houses of worship about how to create safety programs. And so he does a lot in the public. And I thought it was really interesting to get a kind of the outside view in of policing and how we as citizens should think more about the police officers that serve us. So welcome, William. It's great to have you. It's great to have you on the show.
Pleasure to be here, sir. Thank you for having me.
So, William, I'll start with the the tough question. You deal with citizens in Chicago all day long. The level of trust and respect for police officers has declined appreciably over the last 10 years. I think it's less than 50% of Americans trust police, and less than, I think, 30% of African Americans trust police. Is that what you see out there? And how would you articulate the public's view of police?
I guess I've never had a poll. I've never taken one. When people ask, they share polls, I've never really engaged. I can only speak for what I experience. Typically, someone will call in and they'll say, "Hey, listen, could you do X, Y, Z for us?" And we say yes. And so I think overall there is a hesitancy to trust government as a total, not just the police. Because you may have people who are non-responsive, then you show up and then you start finding out you have commonality, then that's when the barrier breaks down. Change can't happen from 35th Michigan, where our headquarters is. You have to go out in the community and talk to people. You sometimes hear things that you may not like to hear, but then I think before you get to trust, it has to be kind of a mutual respect of what their expectations are. So when you go out, and today I was doing a talk for some seniors, but that didn't fall through. But the fact that I showed up versus not showing up means that, okay, they can count on me. So I think particularly in the African American community, there's some long history, but I think that history is broken when the people in the neighborhood, when you converse with police officers, you find out you have a lot in common. I typically do like an icebreaker, and I'm amazed by how many people in the audience have things in common that they're unaware of. Like I'll say, who's a veteran, who's left-handed, things like that, very innocuous things. And then once you start seeing that you're not that different from the person who you sit across from every day, who you don't really know, then that kind of builds the basis of trust.
Well, and I think that speaks, it speaks to the old, the old way of policing. I remember taking my kids to the Nutcracker as our little holiday tradition, and in that Nutcracker, the opening scene is there's a kind of a people hurrying on the street, and then there's a police officer. He's just kind of patrolling the street, swinging his little baton, and when a kid comes up and asks him for directions, and he points him to the right way. It feels like in the old days, that was the way that you got to know the police, right? It was very locally and very. And that unfortunately no longer exists. I mean, do you think that's part of the challenge? Is, to your point, that just the number of interactions are few and far between?
Yeah, I think that the we can't do anything about the number of interactions, but I think that just as police, as city officials, not just the police, if we're courteous to people when we see them on the street and say, "Well, I don't know what that is. Let me help you out." I ran into. I'm kind of decent with Spanish, and for some reason, the guy came up to me and asked me for directions. So I'm like, okay, if all the people watch asked me, and I was able to help him out,
Right.
and I think that my Spanish is it's not fluent, but it was good enough to get him to where he's going. I assume he got where he's going because there was no missing persons report. But just little things like that. To your point, it doesn't have to be running into a building, burning building to get someone. If it's just the casual conversation, the art of the conversation between the public and the police, like griping about the Bears or the White Sox or the Cubs or something like that, and you find out, hey, I feel the same way about them, because I think there's a perception wall that falls between the police and the public, that once you start getting to know people, you know, like take for instance, like a lot of my friends have only girls, and so we have a girl dad club at church, and we kind of crack up about it.
It's called
There's
it's called
very
it's
few people.
called I think it's called a girl sympathy, a
Yeah,
girl sympathy club.
exactly, exactly. But then I have another friend. He has four boys, and two of them are twins, and so his life experience is totally different than mine because I grew up without sisters, and now he's like his wife is like outnumbered, and so it's funny when you start talking about that, and not to divulge too much about your personal life, but once people see, hey, you have four kids, so do I. You went to XYZ school, so do I, and then you start figuring out, hey, we're not that different. That's where I think the barriers are broken down.
Well,
Just the
and
art of conversation.
completely agree. I have four boys, and I would call that that would be the home maintenance, home fixing club in terms of fixing cracks in the walls and
Absolutely.
broken windows. Well, now you've been doing this for a long time. You started on, you said, tax day 2001. That
Yes.
is now. Was that before or after the Bears had a winning season, or is that too hard of a?
I'm not quite sure. That was just a long time ago. I know who the coach was then, but I love my Bears. But I was like, who knows when that was happening? That was 23 years ago. So yeah.
Oh my goodness! And how has policing changed, and how has your job changed over that time period?
I think that a few things. Our department is getting younger. People are retiring. When I first started, people will go to 63 now. I think the kind of the mental stress of the job is getting to some folks, and so and then other opportunities. If you're a 50-year-old police officer with say 20 something years, and you are a hot commodity, so a small suburb is giving you a call to say, hey, do you want to be our chief? And you have to start weighing those odds. I mean, I think a lot of people are looking at age 55 is kind of the new 63. Like 63 is that you have to get out by then. And so typically only like the high bosses will do that. But if you're a police officer at age, say 55, and you've got 20, 30 years of experience, you're a very hot commodity. So we may lose office. Actually, we lose every month. We people retire due to age or just say, hey, I want to get out. But we have an extremely young department. So that's an opportunity to get these officers, acclimated to engage in the community. And also, but the bad side of that is we have a lot of wisdom leaving the door. So I think that over the time, like people, when first started, and I really didn't pay attention to how old people were, but I definitely know there's a trend downward of, people like once they hit that time, they're starting to consider.
And in the context of the community's perception, has it changed over the 20 years?
I don't. I think some high profile incidents that we've taken a hit to it, honestly, and I think sometimes people don't have the whole story of But I think it's because the city has deeper pockets. We can be a target for litigation even before the case is adjudicated, and they'll say, "Aha, you guys settled. That must have been you were guilty." And really, it's just calculus. It's like, okay, if we would go to trial, how much would we lose? And sometimes it's just it makes more sense to settle the case, not admit any harm, because at trial you might be more exposed. And that's not to take away from someone losing their kid, but a lot of cases, I think people need to look at the whole narrative why was this person doing what they were doing before they engaged with the police? Instead of, well, the police shot him. Like, what happened before that? He was beating his girlfriend, or he was out past curfew or whatever. And sometimes that gets lost in the message. And people, are resistant to hearing the whole story. Now, obviously, if the police did something wrong, they'll be held accountable. But, I think that we have to look at the whole lens of what happened from beginning to end.
No, and we were talking before we started the podcast. There's many benefits of social media, and then there's many negatives. And unfortunately, social media has the power to amplify the examples. A few examples, and that is viewed as as the kind of the norm, if that makes any sense.
Yep.
And there's this. I think was it. The number of murders in the United States is down. The number of sexual assaults is down. Yet, if you ask the public, they would feel less safe, and they wouldn't agree with that. In part because when people are murdered or people are assaulted, it's very visible on their social feed.
Exactly. Yeah, in the 1990s, I think Chicago had 1,000 homicides, and that's something people tend to forget. Obviously, one homicide is too many. I think in the 70s, New York had 3,000 homicides, and they're lower. And so when people say, it's like when people talk about interest, or interest rates is 7%. Well, I remember when interest rates were double digit, and if you got a 12% interest rate on your house, you're doing pretty good, because I used to be a mortgage lender. So it's all perspective. Obviously, that's not to take away from anyone's loss, but historically, the trends are going down. But when you talk to people on the street, it's like, oh, it's bad, Chicago's awful. It's like, well, the numbers are going down, and really maybe 0.1% of the people are committing a disproportionate amount of crime. So not every neighborhood is filled with people out to do evil, but there's enough of them, that make an impact.
Well, and unfortunately, Chicago, more than most cities, suffers from that reputation. And to be fair, there are, I think it was so far this year, 410 shootings, 476 people injured, 332 people killed, which is that's a lot, even if it's not at the 1,000 pace before, even if it's coming down. What when you hear from, I'm sure you hear from outside of Chicago, people saying, what the hell's going on, and what are the police doing? I mean, how do you answer that when you go out into the community and someone just asks that very basic question?
Well, I would hope that they would be, like every neighborhood, every community in the U.S. has some level of crime. If it's in Ogden, Utah, or Rhode Island, or whatever. And I think that one, it's a lot of things could be going on. I think parental involvement, in my mind, is very key, because when I was growing up, I'm 57. You couldn't leave at 6 o'clock when the sun goes down. You're in the house, and so we as citizens play a role in that too. So and this isn't to get on a moral stick or anything like that, but really the role of parents is so key, because if you don't know where your kid is at a certain period of time, I think a Philadelphia deputy commissioner said this, then we have a problem. There was a shooting in Indianapolis, which is a relatively safe city, about a year and a half ago. And the deputy chief of police is like, listen, if you don't know where your 14-year-old is right now, then you need to find out where they are, because it was a mall and a shooting, and I think there was some tender age people involved. And so part of it is everybody has a role to play. The government has a role to play, police have a role to play, communities have a role to play, because me and my brothers grew up without a father, but they were father-like figures in the neighborhood that will kind of, pull us aside and teach us how to do things like fix a bike and, run errands and fix stuff. And so they were kind of surrogate parents to us without even trying to be. And so we saw their good example. We said, hey, this guy turned out pretty good. One example I have is a friend of mine. He became the first African-American partner at Winston & Strawn, one of the biggest law firms in the country. His father had a fifth grade education, 12 kids. The majority of his siblings went to college, and his nephew won a Super Bowl with the Pittsburgh Steelers. So that happens because great parenting, great community, and they created community. They didn't have a lot, but they created a great community amongst themselves and say, we're going to succeed. So,
Well, yeah, and to your point, I don't, it's you get me on my own personal soapbox. The what has made America great over hundreds of years is the individual and the family unit taking responsibility, taking charge, and where I do think it goes wrong is when people start to look to nameless government institutions as the answer. If you think about, I live in California, and obviously homelessness is a horrific
yeah,
challenge here. And but when you talk to police and fire, and they're like, hey, that's people say, you got to deal with the problem, and look, that's not really my problem. Maybe we could look at what started homelessness in the first place. How did folks not get taken care of from a mental health issue long ago, or from an addictional perspective? And it's because to your point, it can all be traced back to the home in some shape or form.
yeah.
And to your point, that's not an excuse, but it is. I think people do have to look at themselves in the mirror before they start looking outwards. And is that a message that is that kind of what you say out in the public? I mean, that's not an easy thing to say when you're out
Well,
talking about
I,
crime.
I say that as a private citizen, because there's just so many levels to our job that some things you can't say. But as a private citizen, I can totally say that because I live in a neighborhood called North Lawndale, where you see what happens when you know guys don't take care of their responsibilities, or people litter. I mean, I live on a block that is used to just be all African American. Now it's 50-50 Latino. Everyone gets out and cuts their grass. I mean, you would think you were in Lake Forest, because everyone, and it's not like a week goes by, you see all the lawnmowers coming out. It's like a competition. And so guess what? On our block, there's not a lot of police calls. Actually, I rarely see the police, because everyone on that block is committed to doing one thing: keeping their lawn. And people might think, listening to this might think, what's the deal? Like that sends a signal to people, because I don't mean to go off on tangent, but I had to get my air conditioner fixed, and the air conditioner guy was hilarious, really nice guy. He was tattooed up, and he said, "You know what? I looked at this neighborhood, and I was like, man, this is sketchy. But I got to your block, and I saw it so clean, and so that told me that people on this block care. So really, it's a block by house, block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood approach. If we all just do one thing in a neighborhood, like, okay, every Friday or Saturday we're gonna cut our grass, we're gonna pick up trash, that sends a signal to people that you care. With this apathy, people think, well, it's okay for me to throw, a hamburger out on the street, or whatever, or it's okay to commit a crime here. But if you see active citizens engaged, not just necessarily voting, but with each other and on the block, it does really go a long way in taking the crime down. And then we do that, then that's where you can start building trust with the police. So really, we have to get ourselves together. Then we can go to the police and say, okay, this is how we want to be serviced.
No, I totally agree. You and I were talking before the start of this, and you provided the statistic, which I quote a lot, is that to my friends, is that less than 1% of police officers ever discharge their weapon over their career. Right? I mean, this is 99.99% of police officers never have to use their gun
Right.
in the line of duty, which is and therefore 99% of what they do is not what you see on Blue Bloods.
Right.
It's much more boring and much more what I call preventative in that context. And is that part of your job, to try to help people understand the kind of the day in the life of an officer, and be to
Well,
understand what they do? Or
I think that there's no such thing as, I mean, statistically, there's a typical officer, but the folks our office are great, and it's a diverse group of people. We have some North Side officers, some South Side officers, some East Side officers, some officers who are originally from Chicago, some officers who served in the military. So it's a very diverse group of people. So that's the thing I love about it. The thing that we try to tell the public is, well, we're just like you. I mean, what's that old saying? The public are the police, and the police are the public. That's where you have to begin with. Like, it can't be their identity cannot be, I'm a police officer. Your identity is, I'm a citizen. I'm a father. I'm a mother. I'm an aunt. I'm an uncle. I'm a brother. And a police officer is what I do for a living, but it's not who I am.
Well, and I think that's a great start from an empathetic perspective, because once you humanize the person, to your point, it's not, they do that as their job. A mechanic, can be a good car mechanic, but he's still a father, or, or still a mother. Um, and you realize that a father or a mother, isn't excited about taking their gun out, isn't excited about
Right.
mistreating people. And and I think creating that kind of empathy with the public is so important. It the those who are listening here, and we have a number of law enforcement folks that listen. To some degree, when I talk to folks out there, they in law enforcement, you feel like it's a bit of a losing battle. It's kind of like,
Mm.
you can only talk to so many people, you can only engage so many church groups,
Right.
but generally the perception's going the wrong way. Is there a way? I mean, do you see a kind of light at the end of the tunnel where at some point the pendulum's going to swing back to the
A-
positive side?
Absolutely. It's almost like a political campaign, and I don't mean just you have to be the. One of my favorite presidents was Lyndon Johnson, not because of his policies, but he believed that you have to fight for every vote. You have to go out and ask for every vote. So with every engagement, we have to ask people, hey, partner with us or whatever. And not just to, there's some things that we can do like play basketball with kids, which is nice. But as you interact with people, and I've found this to be just incredibly interesting, people will oftentimes call our office by mistake. And I was like, I'll direct them to the right place, but I'll tell them, here, take my number down. If you get stuck up again, I'm not stuck up. If you get held up again, call me back or email me back. No one's ever taken me up on that offer. But what they're left with is someone who I was not intended to talk to gave me their number and their email and said, if you need help, and usually it's a very innocent question, like, hey, where do I go for records? But in a city as big as Chicago, we have 35,000 employees, including the police and fire department. And so it's easy to get lost, even as a city employee, like, who do I call for this? Who do I call for that? And some people aren't internet savvy. So I'm more optimistic that, over time, and I don't even think has anything to do with the crimes that are going out there. It's the person to person interaction. That's how people win, elections. It's not by, catchy phrases and stuff like that. You know, it's about person to person interaction.
Yeah, and to your point, I guess you gotta feel like, you can win the vote. You gotta feel like you can win the election in this context, and
Mm-hmm.
and I would imagine that's if and let me just ask, if you were giving advice to police chiefs out there, or executives, from what you understand, and frankly, you're in the toughest market. You're the toughest election. You're you're the, you're in the toughest election one could have.
Yeah.
How, if you had 2, 3 pieces of advice for the police executives, what would it be?
You know what? I'm on LinkedIn, and I have varying opinions of LinkedIn, but there are a few officers. There's one from the Kaysville Police Department who's very adept at sharing. I can't remember her name. Lexi Benson. She's on LinkedIn. So if anyone out here is knows Lexi Benson, she's a phenomenal officer. She's the PIO for the Kaysville Police Department in Utah. And what she does is she kind of tells her personal story about, and I'm not sharing, if you're on LinkedIn, you'll see what she posts, but then people start connecting with you to say, hey, I will do the same thing. One of my LinkedIn contacts, not I haven't seen him in 30 years. We went to college together at the University of Illinois. I found out just recently that he had a son that died of an overdose. And I was like, oh my goodness. But, and I'm not saying share our personal information, but, just if you use the social media, because it'll be used for or against you, but just, highlight officers who are doing great things in the neighborhood, or not necessarily saving people's lives, but, you know, this officer X, bought me an ice cream, or the real stuff, not like the canned stuff that we like to put out there. But then people start saying, "Hey, I remember that officer," because I remember from time to time I was walking down the street, going to a bakery for retirement, and then someone stopped and said, "Hey, I remember you from a street safety presentation." Now, honestly, I didn't remember this lady at all, but I remember she recounted what I told her. I was like, "Yep, that's what I tell people." I I couldn't remember this lady because I do a lot of street safety presentations, and I'm running into people on the street, and they remember that. So, the public will become your biggest advocate if you just do some engagement. If officers aren't don't feel like they're good naturally public speakers, you know, I say train them. Learn how the ABCs of the department. Learn about the facts. Like keep telling people about the very low percentage of people who actually are that discharge a weapon, because that's not the narrative. When you look at TV, not to blame them, the police are shooting someone every week, but most police officers, what's that TV show, Barney Miller? That's more the most, yeah, it's more accurate depiction of police than anything else, because it shows kind of like unusual arrests. No one's rarely was anyone getting shot. They just worked cases, and they have a lot of different officers. You have the intellectual kind, you have the Asian American officer who's hilarious, and you have officers who want to do something aside from being a police officer. That people said is the most accurate depiction of police officers ever.
And I'll show my age by saying Mayberry RFD is even.
Yeah. I'm in that age range too.
Even better in the context of, and people say, oh, gee, that's a small town in whatever, North Carolina. But I think to your point, in both cases, it shows these police officers as people first, right? Fathers first, husbands first, and then, and it shows that they are, they're equal, they're just like you, and they just happen to put a badge on, and I think the other element is that, they're there to, it's called to serve, right? It's a call to service, and to your point, they want to be helpful, and I find that with 99.99% of the people I engage in policing is that they didn't take the job to be angry, they didn't take the job to be disrespectful. They took the job to serve and to help their community.
Right.
William, this has been super interesting and super valuable for me. Thank you for taking the time, and thank you for what you
My
do
pleasure.
every day out there, preaching the good word, frankly, and trying to win that very challenging election, so to speak. My last question for you won't be how the Bears are going to do. Well, let me ask before my last question: how you feeling about the Bears?
They win 2 more games. I don't think they make the playoffs, but I think they win 2 more games.
All right. Well, all right. So it's so like the policing, like the you believe it's an up year. The pendulum's going the right
it's
way.
up year. It's the long road. Look at teams that have been successful for a extended period of time. They had increments like the Dallas Cowboys or the Patriots. It takes time. Like so, even Chicago, it's going to take time, but we'll get there.
Yeah, well, and I'm hoping my 49ers can finally break through. That's my
oh my goodness, yeah.
That's my goal.
I was a big Joe Montana fan, and it's like no matter who they bring in, it's like that the magic of Montana and Rice. I don't know if that can ever be duplicated, but so.
Well, I'm hoping. I'm got my fingers crossed. Well, I will ask you the last question, and that is, Pepperball appreciates what you do, and we appreciate what you do. We'd love to make an honorarium donation in a charity of your choice. Kind of, what would that charity be?
That would be the Chicago Police Memorial Foundation. It's a great organization started by Superintendent Philip Klein. You can Google it and get the information, and just you don't have to put my name on it. They're a great organization. They help officers in distress and officers killed in the line of duty. They step up and support the family. So that's a great organization.
All right. Well, William, again, appreciate it. It's William Townsell, Assistant Director with the Chicago Police Department, Office of Community Policing. William, thanks for taking the time.
My pleasure.
Well, folks, we've, over the last couple of months, listened to a bunch of different perspectives about policing. And, the more I do this and the more I talk to folks, the more, the simpler it seems to be. And that is, and I think William did a great job of articulating, and that is, how do you create a connection? How do you create engagement? And how do you create a personal relationship? Because once people realize in the community, it's a father or a brother or, Bills fan or a Chiefs fan talking to you. It's not this unnamed, labeled police agency or force. It's and that they're there as they are 99% of the time to just serve and support and kind of help you have a safer day. I think William made some really interesting points about leveraging social media, and I think that's, if in the old days Mayberry RFD you could engage on the streets, that's not possible anymore. But social media, which can portray the negative, it also can portray the positive. And I think the notion that his call to action to police chiefs and police executives out there to use social media to create a sense of empathy, a sense of a little bit of vulnerability, that people can see you as you are and understand who you are. Then when a bad thing happens, and it will, at least they understand that the person that's managing the police agency is someone that they can relate to, and it's someone like them who has kids of their own, and and is someone that is there for the right reasons. So I think my takeaway from William is just be a lot more active social media, because it's the only way to reach people, and it's a good way to, you might as well use the tool that can be used against you. You might as well be proactive about using that tool. Thanks again for listening. Again, it's Bob Plaschke with Pepperball. I'm so grateful to that Pepperball sponsors this podcast, and so grateful that I'm able to work and support emergency responders in kind of every day I come to work. So we'll see you next time. Thanks again for listening.